The silence was the first thing that struck you. Not the silence of the grave, but the profound, heavy quiet that settles over a place where a terrible truth has been buried alive. It was the silence of a house that had swallowed a secret whole, digesting it slowly over decades until the very timbers groaned with its weight. And within that silence, a question lingered, a whisper that no one dared voice aloud, yet everyone felt. Why him? Why, of all the souls toiling under the relentless Virginia sun, was one young man plucked from the fields and brought into the master's house? The reason was never spoken, never recorded, never even hinted at in the hushed conversations behind closed doors. It was a choice made in the suffocating heat of an antebellum summer, a decision that would unravel a family, expose a legacy built on sand, and forever alter the life of Elias, the chosen one. His story is not one of freedom, nor of simple servitude, but of a man forced to live inside the very heart of a lie, where the air was thick with unspoken histories, and the shadows held more truth than the light. And as we delve into the suffocating intimacy of that house, you will find yourself asking, as Elias did, what unspeakable horror could compel a master to make such a choice, and why, to this day, the reason was never written down. Before we continue with the story of Elias and Edmund Hatcher, if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? The year was 1847, and the air in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, hung thick and humid, heavy with the scent of ripening tobacco and the unspoken weight of generations. The Hatcher Plantation, known as Oakwood, sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres, its fields a patchwork quilt of green and brown that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the dark, brooding line of distant woods. At its heart stood the main house, a grand, two-story structure of whitewashed brick, its columns rising like silent sentinels, its windows gazing out with an almost mournful dignity. It was a house built on ambition, on the sweat of enslaved labor, and on a particular kind of southern pride that masked a multitude of sins. For decades, Oakwood had been a pillar of the county, its master, Edmund Hatcher, a figure of formidable presence, his name synonymous with prosperity and an unyielding will. He was a man whose gaze could wither a lesser soul, whose voice, though rarely raised, carried the weight of absolute authority. Yet, even in his prime, there had always been a certain gauntness to his features, a shadow in his eyes that hinted at a deeper, more personal torment, a secret gnawing at him from within. Now, at 58, a widower for nearly a decade, that shadow had deepened, etching lines of weariness and something akin to despair around his mouth. He moved through his grand house like a ghost. His presence felt more than seen, a silent, brooding force that permeated every corner of Oakwood. Elias, at 22, knew only the fields. His world had been defined by the rhythmic swing of the hoe, the sharp, acrid smell of tobacco leaves, the relentless sun beating down on his back, and the camaraderie of shared suffering in the slave quarters. He was a man of quiet strength, his frame lean and wiry from years of labor, his hands calloused, his face etched with the early signs of a life lived under duress. But beneath the surface, Elias possessed an intelligence that set him apart, a keen observational mind that absorbed every detail, every nuance of the world around him. He listened more than he spoke, his dark eyes missing nothing, filing away information with a precision that belied his lack of formal education. His mother, Nora, had been a field slave, a woman of quiet dignity and fierce love, who had died when Elias was just 12, leaving him with little more than a faded memory of her gentle touch and the enduring ache of her absence. He remembered her stories, whispered late at night in the cramped cabin, tales of resilience and hope, but also of the brutal realities of their existence. Her death had hardened him, not into bitterness, but into a quiet resolve, a determination to survive, to endure, to remain unbroken. His closest confidant in the quarters was Abner, an elder slave, perhaps 60 years old, whose skin was like worn leather and whose eyes held the wisdom of countless seasons. Abner had seen generations come and go, had witnessed the rise and fall of masters, and understood the intricate, often brutal dance between power and subjugation. He was a quiet man, too, but his silence was different from Elias's. It was the silence of one who had learned that words, when spoken carelessly, could be dangerous. Abner often shared his knowledge in parables, in knowing glances, in the subtle shifts of his body language. He had taken Elias under his wing after Nora's passing, teaching him the rhythms of the land, the unspoken rules of survival, and the importance of keeping one's own counsel. Elias respected Abner deeply, recognizing in him a profound understanding of the world that transcended the boundaries of their imposed reality. Life in the quarters was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the main house. The cabins, crude and functional, huddled together in a cluster, their dirt floors swept clean, their meager possessions carefully arranged. The air here was filled with the smells of wood smoke, cooking greens, and unwashed bodies, punctuated by the sounds of children's laughter, the low murmur of conversation, and the occasional mournful spiritual sung softly in the twilight. It was a world of its own, separate yet inextricably linked to the house on the hill. Elias moved through it with a quiet grace, his presence acknowledged by nods and brief knowing glances. He was one of them, a field hand, destined for a life of endless labor, his future as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. He had accepted this fate, not with resignation, but with the quiet strength of one who understood the limits of his world. He had no illusions, no grand dreams of escape, only the daily struggle for dignity and survival. His internal world, though rich with observation and quiet thought, was carefully guarded, a sanctuary against the harsh realities of his external existence. He was Elias of the fields, and that was all he had ever been. The thought that this carefully constructed normalcy, this predictable rhythm of his life, was about to be shattered, would have been unthinkable, a notion too fantastical to entertain. Yet the unseen currents of fate, guided by the dark, unspoken desires of a powerful man, were already swirling, preparing to pull him from the familiar earth and into the suffocating, gilded cage of the master's house. The day the world shifted for Elias began like any other, under a sky of relentless, cloudless blue. The sun beat down with an oppressive intensity, baking the earth and drawing beads of sweat from every brow. The air shimmered above the rows of tobacco plants, and the rhythmic thwack of hose against soil was the only sound that dared challenge the buzzing of cicadas. Elias was deep in the fields, his back aching, his muscles burning, his mind focused on the task at hand, a meditative state born of repetition and necessity. He moved with an efficiency honed by years, his eyes scanning the broad green leaves for any sign of pest or blight, his hands deftly plucking and pruning. The dust, fine and red, coated his skin, mingled with his sweat, and settled in the creases of his clothes. Then a ripple went through the field, a hush fell, not sudden but gradual, like a wave receding from the shore. Heads began to turn, slowly, cautiously, towards the edge of the field where the path from the main house met the cultivated land. Elias, sensing the shift in atmosphere, paused, his hoe resting against his shoulder. His gaze followed the others, and his breath caught in his throat. There, standing at the edge of their world, was Edmund Hatcher. He was not alone. Beside him stood Thomas Hatcher, his son, a man of 30 whose face was already set in lines of petulance and inherited authority. Thomas, with his florid complexion and perpetually narrowed eyes, was a cruel man in the specific, casual way of those who have never known true hardship. He managed the day-to-day operations of the plantation, his presence in the fields usually a harbinger of harsh words or swift punishment. But today his expression was not one of anger but of visible displeasure, a tight-lipped frown that seemed to deepen the lines around his mouth. Behind them, the field foreman, a burly white man named Mr. Davies, stood a respectful distance, his usual bluster replaced by an uncharacteristic nervousness. Edmund Hatcher, however, was the focal point. He stood tall, despite his age, his posture still commanding, though his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. He wore a linen suit, impeccably white against the dusty landscape, a stark contrast to the earth-stained clothes of the field hands. His eyes, usually fixed on some distant, unseen horizon, now swept slowly across the rows of enslaved men and women, a deliberate, unnerving survey. The silence deepened, becoming almost unbearable, punctuated only by the distant caw of a crow and the frantic beating of Elias's own heart. Every man and woman in that field knew that when the master came to the fields, it was never for a casual inspection. It was always for a purpose, often a grim one. Edmund's gaze paused. It lingered, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, his arm rose, his index finger extending, pointing, not at a problem in the crop, not at a specific task. He pointed directly at Elias. Elias felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He stood frozen, his hoe still, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend. He looked around, half expecting the finger to shift, to point at someone else, anyone else, but it remained fixed on him. The field foreman, Mr. Davies, stepped forward, his voice a hesitant murmur. "Master Hatcher, is there a problem with Elias's work?" Edmund Hatcher did not lower his arm. His voice, when it came, was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried across the silent field with an chilling clarity. "No problem, Davies. Elias, you are to come with me. You will work in the house now." No explanation, no reason, just a pronouncement delivered with the finality of a decree. Thomas Hatcher shifted uncomfortably, a low, guttural sound escaping his throat. "Father, with all due respect, Elias is a field hand. He knows nothing of housework. We have Ruth and the others." Edmund's eyes, sharp and cold, cut Thomas off. "My decision, Thomas. It is made." The words were not a request, but a dismissal of any argument. Thomas fell silent, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. The other slaves in the field remained motionless, their faces unreadable, but Elias felt the weight of their gaze, a specific, heavy silence that was not of surprise, but of something older, something akin to dread. They knew in their bones that such a choice, made without explanation, was rarely a blessing. It was a mark, a separation, a plunge into an unknown that could be far more perilous than the familiar hardships of the fields. Elias felt their pity, their fear, and perhaps a flicker of morbid curiosity. He was being singled out, and in their world, to be singled out was often to be marked for a fate no one envied. Elias slowly lowered his hoe to the ground. His legs felt heavy as if rooted to the earth. He took a deep breath, the air suddenly tasting metallic and strange. He glanced at Abner, who stood a few rows away, his face a study in stoicism. But in Abner's eyes, Elias saw a flicker of profound concern, a silent warning. "Come, Elias," Edmund Hatcher said, his voice now softer, almost coaxing, a tone Elias had never heard directed at him before. It was more unsettling than any command. Elias walked, his steps stiff, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He left the familiar scent of tobacco and dust, the comforting rhythm of shared labor, and walked towards the imposing figure of the master, towards the grand house that had always been a distant, untouchable presence. As he passed Thomas, he felt the younger Hatcher's hostile gaze, a palpable wave of resentment that promised future trouble. The walk to the house was a blur. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sounds of the fields faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the manicured gardens, and the unsettling quiet of the master's domain. He was led through a side entrance, into the cool, shadowed interior of the house, a place he had only ever glimpsed from afar. The air inside was different, cooler, heavier, scented with beeswax, old paper, and something indefinable, something that spoke of secrets and long-held histories. Ruth, a house slave in her mid-30s, her face a mixture of apprehension and a strange, guarded sympathy, met them in the back corridor. She had worked inside the house for years, her movements quiet and efficient, her eyes accustomed to seeing everything while appearing to see nothing. She was a woman who understood the intricate, unspoken rules of the house, and her presence now was a silent testament to the gravity of Elias's new situation. "Ruth, show Elias to his room," Edmund Hatcher commanded, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed hallway. "He will attend me personally. See that he understands his duties." Ruth nodded, her gaze meeting Elias's for a fleeting moment, a silent message passing between them. A message of warning, of shared understanding, of the precariousness of his new position. She led him down a narrow, dimly lit corridor, away from the grander rooms towards the back of the house. The floorboards creaked softly under their feet, each sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. His room was small, barely more than a closet, tucked away off the back corridor, just steps from the master's private study. It contained a narrow cot, a small wooden chest, and a single high window that offered a sliver of sky. It was clean, sparse, and utterly devoid of personal touches. It was a space designed for utility, for a presence that was meant to be unseen, unheard, yet always available. "This is where you'll sleep," Ruth whispered, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You'll be close to Master Hatcher's study. He likes to be able to call on you at any hour." Her eyes held a deep, unsettling knowing. "You listen. You learn. You keep your mouth shut. And you watch." Elias nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. He looked around the tiny room, feeling the walls close in on him. The air was still, heavy, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and cold, like fear. That first night inside the house was a torment. The sounds were alien, magnified in the darkness. The creak of floorboards above, the distant chime of a grandfather clock, the rustle of leaves outside the window, the soft, almost imperceptible murmur of voices from other parts of the house. He lay on the cot, his body stiff, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the inexplicable choice that had plucked him from his familiar world. He felt like a bird, trapped in a gilded cage, the bars invisible but no less real. He could feel the presence of the house around him, a living, breathing entity filled with secrets. And then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound from the master's study, just beyond his wall. A sigh, a clink of glass, and then a long, drawn-out silence. Elias knew, with a chilling certainty, that Edmund Hatcher was awake, just as he was. And he knew, too, that the master was watching him, even through the walls, with an attention that had no name, an intensity that promised a future far more complicated and terrifying than any he could have imagined in the sun-drenched fields. The reason for his selection remained a terrifying void, a question mark hanging over his head, and the silence of the house seemed to mock his desperate need for understanding. Weeks bled into months, each day inside the house a slow, deliberate unraveling of Elias's former life. The rhythms of the house were vastly different from the fields, a silent, intricate dance of duties and unspoken expectations. Elias learned quickly, his observant nature serving him well. His primary role was to attend Edmund Hatcher personally, laying out his clothes, preparing his morning tea, serving his meals in the dining room, and most frequently maintaining his private study. He became a shadow, moving through the grand, echoing rooms with a quiet efficiency, his presence almost imperceptible, yet always there. He learned the geography of the house, the creaking floorboards, the drafts that whispered through the long corridors, the way the light shifted through the tall windows at different times of day. He learned the smells, the faint, sweet decay of old flowers in the parlor, the sharp tang of lemon polish, the musty scent of forgotten books in the library, and the ever-present cloying aroma of Edmund Hatcher's pipe tobacco. But more than the physical space, Elias learned the emotional landscape of the Hatcher family, a terrain as treacherous and unpredictable as any wilderness. Clara Hatcher, Edmund's daughter, was a woman of 24, her beauty tinged with a profound sadness that seemed to cling to her like a fine mist. She moved through the house with a quiet grace, her eyes often distant, lost in some private world. Elias observed her in the morning sitting by the window, a book open in her lap, though she rarely seemed to read. Her education, unusual for a woman of her station in that time, seemed to have only deepened her unhappiness, making her acutely aware of the gilded cage she inhabited. She would sometimes offer Elias a small, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of acknowledgement that was more than any other white member of the household offered, yet it was always accompanied by a look of profound pity, as if she saw a reflection of her own entrapment in his new servitude. Thomas Hatcher, on the other hand, made no secret of his resentment. His cruelty, once directed at the field hands, now found a new, more personal target in Elias. He would find fault where there was none, issue contradictory commands, and often simply stand and stare at Elias with a simmering hatred that was almost palpable. Elias understood that Thomas saw him not just as a slave, but as an interloper, a symbol of his father's inexplicable favoritism, a threat to his own position as heir. Thomas's eyes, when they met Elias's, were always cold, always calculating, promising retribution for a slight that Elias had not committed, but merely embodied. Mrs. Dorothea Price, the housekeeper, a white woman in her late 50s, was a formidable presence. She had served the Hatcher family for over 20 years, her knowledge of the house and its inhabitants encyclopedic. Her face was a roadmap of tight lines and carefully controlled expressions, her eyes sharp and knowing, yet always guarded. She moved with a stiff, almost brittle dignity, her starched aprons rustling softly as she went about her duties. Mrs. Price was a master of careful silences, a woman who had learned that survival in this house sometimes meant swallowing what you knew, burying it deep within. She watched Elias with a mixture of suspicion and a strange, almost maternal concern, her instructions always precise, her warnings often delivered in clipped, ambiguous phrases that hinted at deeper currents beneath the surface. She was a keeper of secrets, and Elias sensed that her knowledge extended far beyond the daily running of the household. But it was Edmund Hatcher who remained the central, most unsettling figure in Elias's new existence. The master's habits became a predictable, yet no less disturbing routine. Every night, without fail, Edmund would retire to his private study, locking the heavy oak door behind him. Elias would hear the soft click of the lock, a sound that marked the boundary between the public and private worlds of the master. Inside, Edmund would drink, often late into the night, the clink of glass and the occasional heavy sigh the only sounds that escaped the thick walls. On the wall of the study, above the imposing fireplace, hung a portrait. It was of a woman, her features soft yet strong, her eyes possessing a luminous quality that seemed to follow Elias as he cleaned the room. She was beautiful, dressed in a simple, elegant gown, her dark hair pulled back from a high forehead. No one in the house ever spoke her name. It was simply the portrait, a silent, beautiful ghost that presided over Edmund's solitary hours. Elias often caught Edmund staring at it, his face a mask of profound sorrow, a raw, unguarded emotion that was rarely seen in the master's public demeanor. Most disturbing of all was the way Edmund sometimes stopped in the middle of a sentence, his gaze drifting from whatever he was doing to fix on Elias. It was not a look of anger, nor of simple command. It was an intense, almost obsessive stare, an expression that had no name in the language of masters and enslaved men. It was a look of profound contemplation, of searching, as if Edmund were trying to find something in Elias's face, something he had lost, or perhaps something he desperately wished to see. Elias would stand motionless, his heart pounding, feeling the weight of that gaze, the unspoken questions behind it. He learned to keep his own face impassive, his eyes downcast, revealing nothing of the turmoil within. He became a blank canvas, a mirror reflecting nothing back to the master, hoping to deflect the unsettling intensity of that stare. Elias, with his keen observational mind, began to keep a mental record of everything. The subtle shifts in Mrs. Price's tone, the way Clara's eyes would linger on the portrait, the venom in Thomas's voice, and most of all, the master's unsettling gaze. He pieced together fragments, like a mosaic slowly forming in his mind, though the full picture remained elusive, shrouded in the house's pervasive silence. One Sunday, during the brief respite allowed to the enslaved, Elias managed to slip away to the quarters. He found Abner sitting outside his cabin, whittling a piece of wood, his movements slow and deliberate. Elias sat beside him, the familiar smells of wood smoke and earth a welcome balm after the perfumed air of the house. He spoke little, but Abner, with his deep understanding, sensed the change in him. "Boy," Abner said, his voice a low rumble, not looking up from his work. "You've been chosen for something." He paused, the knife carving a delicate curl from the wood. "And nothing that man chooses comes free." Elias looked at the old man, his eyes searching. "What do you mean, Abner?" Abner finally looked up, his ancient eyes meeting Elias's. "That house, it ain't just brick and timber, it got its own kind of hunger. And Master Hatcher, he got his own kind of ghosts. You in there now, Elias. You ain't just serving him, you serving his secrets. And secrets, boy, they got a price." He returned to his whittling, the message delivered, clear and chilling. Elias returned to the house that evening, Abner's words echoing in his mind. He was not just a servant, he was a witness. He was not just living in the house, he was living inside its secrets. And the master's gaze, once merely unsettling, now felt like a brand, marking him as part of a story he did not yet understand, a story that promised to be far more sinister than any he could have imagined. The silence of the house, once merely oppressive, now felt like a living entity, a suffocating blanket woven from decades of unspoken truths, and Elias, now at its very heart, was beginning to feel its crushing weight. The turning point came on a Tuesday, a day that began like any other, yet ended with the world irrevocably altered for Elias. Edmund Hatcher had ridden into town for a meeting with the county magistrate, a rare absence that left the house with an unusual, almost palpable lightness. Elias was tasked with his usual duties in the study, dusting the heavy mahogany desk, polishing the brass fixtures, and tidying the stacks of ledgers and correspondence. The room, usually imbued with the master's brooding presence, felt strangely empty, almost vulnerable. As Elias meticulously wiped down the surface of the desk, his cloth snagged on something. He looked down. A small, ornate drawer, usually kept locked, was ajar, barely a sliver but enough to catch the light. Edmund, in his haste, had left it unlocked. A tremor ran through Elias. He knew instinctively that this was a boundary he should not cross, a forbidden space. Yet the magnetic pull of the unknown, the desperate need to understand the master's unsettling gaze, the house's pervasive silence, was too strong to resist. Abner's words, "Nothing that man chooses comes free," echoed in his mind. He felt a profound sense of foreboding, but also an undeniable, almost reckless curiosity. His heart pounded against his ribs as he glanced around the empty room, then down the silent corridor. No one. He took a deep, shaky breath, and with trembling fingers gently pulled the drawer open further. Inside, nestled beneath a layer of yellowed parchment, lay a small bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were not official documents, not business correspondence. These were personal, intimate, their edges softened by time. Elias carefully, almost reverently, picked up the bundle. The paper felt fragile, delicate, as if it might crumble in his hands. He untied the ribbon, his fingers fumbling slightly. The letters were written in a graceful, flowing hand. The ink faded to sepia. He saw the dates: 1825, 1827, 1830, 1831. They were old, predating his own birth by many years. He scanned the first one, his eyes quickly deciphering the elegant script. It was addressed to "My dearest Edmund," and signed simply with an initial, N. A cold wave washed over Elias. N. The initial resonated deep within him, stirring a memory, a whisper from his childhood. He knew that initial. He had seen it, etched into a small, smooth stone his mother had kept hidden in her meager possessions. Nora, his mother. He began to read, his breath catching in his throat, each word a hammer blow to his carefully constructed understanding of the world. The letters spoke of a child, a secret child, conceived in a time of desperate hope and forbidden passion. They spoke of a promise Edmund had made, a promise of protection, of a future that would never come to pass. They spoke of a woman who understood, with a chilling clarity, that she would never leave the plantation alive, that her fate was sealed by the very secret she carried. One letter, dated 1827, stood out, its words searing themselves into Elias's mind. "My dearest Edmund, I write to you again, though I know these words may never reach your heart, only your hands. The child grows within me, a living testament to our folly, our brief, stolen moments. You promised, Edmund. You promised he would be safe, that he would know a life beyond the fields. But I see the way things are. I see the fear in your eyes, the shame. You will not acknowledge him. You cannot, and I know my place. I know what will become of me and of him if this truth ever sees the light of day. Protect him, Edmund. If not for me, then for the part of you that lives within him. Do not let him suffer the fate of his mother. I pray for his soul and for yours, though I fear yours is already lost to the darkness you have chosen." Elias's hands trembled so violently he almost dropped the letter. The words swam before his eyes, yet their meaning was terrifyingly clear. The child grows within me. He would know a life beyond the fields, the part of you that lives within him. And then, the crushing realization, do not let him suffer the fate of his mother, Nora, and the child, him, Elias. The air in the study suddenly felt thin, suffocating. The portrait above the fireplace, the woman with the luminous eyes, seemed to gaze down at him with a knowing sorrow. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw a faint, almost imperceptible resemblance to his mother, a shared strength in the set of the jaw, a similar depth in the eyes. Was this the woman Edmund truly loved? Or was she merely a symbol, a stand-in for the forbidden love he had betrayed? He did not take the letters. He did not even consider it. The weight of them, the sheer devastating truth they contained, was too immense to carry. With meticulous care, his hands still shaking, he folded the letter he had read, placed it back with the others, and tied the faded blue ribbon exactly as he had found it. He gently returned the bundle to the drawer, pushing it closed until it clicked softly into place. He then wiped down the desk again, his movements automatic, his mind reeling. He finished his duties in a daze, the familiar objects of the study now imbued with a sinister new meaning. The heavy desk, the leather-bound books, the very air of the room, all seemed to hum with the unspoken secret. He moved through the rest of the day like a ghost, his body performing its tasks, while his mind replayed the words of the letter, the terrifying implications of N. That night, Elias did not sleep. He lay on his narrow cot, staring at the sliver of moonlight that pierced his high window. The sounds of the house, once merely alien, now felt like the whispers of conspirators. Every creak, every distant murmur seemed to confirm the terrible truth he had unearthed. Edmund Hatcher's unsettling gaze, his inexplicable choice, the house's pervasive silence, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying revelation. He was not just a slave chosen for service. He was a secret, brought into the very heart of the man who had created him, a living, breathing testament to a betrayal that had spanned decades. He was the child of Nora, the child of Edmund Hatcher, and the reason he was inside the house was not kindness, not utility, but a desperate, twisted attempt by his father to keep a living ghost close, a constant reminder of a promise broken, a life ruined, and a truth that, if ever spoken aloud, would shatter the very foundations of Oakwood. The first shadow had fallen, and Elias knew with a chilling certainty that his life and the lives of everyone in that house would never be the same. The revelation of the letters, the undeniable truth of his parentage, did not explode within Elias. Instead, it settled, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of his stomach, radiating outward to permeate every fiber of his being. He now saw everything through a new, terrifying lens. Edmund Hatcher's attention, once merely unsettling, was no longer random. It was not kindness, nor simple utility. It was the gaze of a man haunted, a man who could not stop looking at the face of a woman he had wronged, a woman now dead, a face he saw every time he looked at the son he had never acknowledged. Elias was not just a servant. He was a living, breathing accusation, a constant, silent reminder of Edmund's deepest shame. The entire architecture of the house took on a new, sinister meaning. The grand columns, the polished floors, the heavy draperies, they were not just symbols of wealth, but the elaborate facade of a lie. The silence that permeated Oakwood was no longer just the quiet of a well-run household. It was the suffocating silence of complicity, of unspoken truths, of a secret so profound it had warped the lives of everyone within its walls. Elias felt as though he were living inside a tomb, where the air was thick with the ghosts of the past, and he, the unacknowledged son, was the most potent ghost of all. He began to observe the others with a heightened sensitivity, searching for confirmation, for any sign that they too knew. And slowly, subtly, the pieces began to fall into place. Ruth, the house slave, who had watched his arrival with a mixture of sympathy and dread, now seemed to regard him with a deeper, more profound sorrow. In fragments, in hushed tones when they were alone in the pantry or the laundry room, she began to confirm what Elias had suspected. "Nora, she wasn't always in the fields, you know," Ruth whispered one afternoon, her eyes darting nervously towards the door. "There was a time, long before you were born, she was in the house, a seamstress, Master Hatcher. He had a fondness for her work." Ruth's words were carefully chosen, veiled, but the implication hung heavy in the air. She spoke of a time when things were different, a time before the current Mrs. Hatcher, a time when Nora had been closer to the master, a time when the lines between master and enslaved woman had blurred in the dangerous intimacy of the house. Ruth never said more, but her knowing glances, her sudden silences, spoke volumes. She had been there, or heard the whispers from those who had. Mrs. Price, the housekeeper, with her tightly controlled expressions, now seemed to carry an even heavier burden. Elias noticed the way her gaze would sometimes linger on him, a flicker of something akin to guilt or regret in her usually impassive eyes. She would sometimes sigh, a deep, weary sound, when Edmund was particularly withdrawn, or when Thomas was especially cruel. Elias understood that Mrs. Price knew. She had been with the family for decades, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, a keeper of the house's darkest secrets. Her careful silences were not just a habit. They were a shield, a survival mechanism in a house built on lies. Even Dr. Nathaniel Graves, the Hatcher family physician who visited the plantation occasionally, seemed to carry a piece of the secret. Elias observed the way Dr. Graves would sometimes exchange a brief, almost imperceptible glance with Edmund, a look of shared understanding that bypassed words. He noticed the doctor's discomfort when Nora's name was inadvertently mentioned by an older field hand, a quick, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Dr. Graves, a man of science and discretion, was clearly privy to the family's hidden history, his medical knowledge perhaps extending beyond physical ailments to the deeper psychological wounds of the Hatcher household. And Thomas. His simmering resentment towards Elias now made chilling sense. Thomas knew, or at least suspected, his cruelty was not just the casual brutality of a master, but the targeted malice of a man who saw a living affront to his legitimacy, a constant reminder of his father's transgression. His hatred for Elias was rooted in a profound insecurity, a fear that his own inheritance, his own claim to the Hatcher name, was somehow tainted by the presence of his unacknowledged half-brother. Clara, Edmund's daughter, with her quiet sadness, also took on new meaning. Her education, her quiet rebellion against the strictures of her world, now seemed to be intertwined with the house's secret. Elias recalled her small, almost imperceptible nods, her looks of profound pity. He realized now that she had been trying, in her own way, to protect him, to offer a silent solace, without ever being able to say why. She too was trapped by the secret, a prisoner of her father's shame, and her sadness was the burden of a truth she could not speak. The weight of this knowledge, this shared, unspoken history, pressed down on Elias. He walked through the house, performing his duties, but his mind was a maelstrom of emotions. Grief for his mother, anger at Edmund, a profound sense of injustice, and a chilling fear for his own future. He was no longer just Elias of the fields. He was Elias, the secret, the living embodiment of Edmund Hatcher's sin. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Edmund Hatcher summoned Elias to the study. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of whiskey and pipe tobacco. Edmund sat in his high-backed leather chair, a glass in his hand, his face shadowed by the dim light of the single lamp. Elias stood before him, his heart pounding, knowing this was not a summons for a simple task. This was different. This was the moment. Edmund drank deeply, the ice clinking softly against the glass. He did not look at Elias directly, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame in the fireplace. The silence stretched, long and agonizing, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the distant chirping of crickets. Elias waited, his face impassive, his body rigid, prepared for whatever truth might finally emerge. When Edmund finally spoke, his voice was low, raspy, almost a whisper. But it was not about the letters. It was not about Nora. It was not about the truth. He spoke around it, in the oblique, circuitous language of men who cannot say what they mean, who are too consumed by shame and pride to utter the words that would set them free. "This land, Elias," Edmund began, his voice barely audible. "It is more than just soil and crops. It is a legacy, a name. It is what a man leaves behind." He paused, taking another long swallow of whiskey. "My father, he built this, from nothing, and I have kept it, maintained it, added to it." His gaze finally shifted, not to Elias's eyes, but to his hands, calloused and strong. A man. He owes something to what he has made, to his name, to his blood. Elias listened, his mind racing, trying to decipher the veiled confession. Edmund was speaking of legacy, of blood, of what a man owes. He was speaking of Elias, without ever speaking his name. He was acknowledging the connection, the shared blood, without ever uttering the words son or father. "There are obligations," Edmund continued, his voice growing fainter, as if the words themselves were a physical burden. "To the past, to the future, to order." He gestured vaguely around the study, at the books, the ledgers, the symbols of his carefully constructed world. Order must be maintained, at all costs. Elias said almost nothing. He simply stood, a silent, unmoving presence, absorbing every word, every nuance, every unspoken truth. He understood. Edmund was not confessing. He was justifying. He was not seeking forgiveness. He was seeking understanding for the choices he had made, the order he had preserved, even at the cost of a life, even at the cost of his own soul. He was acknowledging Elias's existence, his place in the legacy, but only within the confines of the established order, the order that had denied him his name, his freedom, his rightful place. When Edmund finally dismissed him with a weary wave of his hand, Elias turned and left the study, the heavy oak door closing softly behind him. But something had shifted between them. An acknowledgement without words, a recognition without confession. The silence that had once been a barrier was now a shared space, a suffocating intimacy born of a terrible unspoken truth. Elias knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was not just living in the house, he was living inside Edmund Hatcher's conscience, a constant, silent tormentor, a living ghost of a past that refused to stay buried. The weight of this silence, this profound, shared secret, was almost unbearable, and Elias knew with a sinking heart that it would only grow heavier with time. If this story is already making the hair on the back of your neck stand up, you're not alone. Hit that like button to let us know you're still with us. Leave your theories in the comments below and share this video with someone who loves dark history. Now, back to the house on the hill. The months that followed the unspoken acknowledgement in the study were the most dangerous Elias had yet endured. The fragile truce, The silent understanding between him and Edmund seemed only to inflame the simmering resentments of others, particularly Thomas. The house, once a place of oppressive quiet, now felt like a pressure cooker, its cracks slowly widening under the strain of its hidden truths. Thomas Hatcher, his face perpetually flushed with anger and drink, began to actively move against Elias. His accusations grew bolder, his cruelties more pointed. He would accuse Elias of petty thefts, a missing silver spoon, a misplaced ledger, knowing full well they were lies. He would deliberately assign Elias impossible tasks, then berate him for his failure. His ultimate goal was clear: to have Elias sent back to the fields, or worse, sold to another plantation, to remove the living affront to his own legitimacy. "He's insolent, father," Thomas would bellow, his voice echoing through the dining room during meals, his eyes fixed on Elias. "He's not suited for housework. He belongs with the others." Edmund, however, would merely sigh, a weary, dismissive sound, and wave his hand, always protecting Elias, always keeping him close, a decision that only fueled Thomas's rage. Elias learned to anticipate Thomas's attacks, to deflect them with a quiet stoicism, knowing that any reaction would only provide Thomas with the justification he sought. He moved through the house with a heightened sense of vigilance, every shadow a potential threat, every corner a possible ambush. The visits of Dr. Nathaniel Graves, once infrequent, seemed to become more regular. Edmund's health, always precarious, seemed to be declining more rapidly, his gauntness more pronounced, his cough deeper. During one such visit, Elias, tasked with bringing fresh water to the study, overheard a fragment of conversation that chilled him to the bone. The door was slightly ajar, and Dr. Graves's voice, usually calm and measured, was laced with a rare urgency. "Edmund, Doctor," Graves said, his tone low. "You cannot keep him here indefinitely. It is unnatural and dangerous for everyone involved." Edmund's reply was a low growl. "He stays. He is mine to keep. But the implications, Edmund, the risk, if word ever got out, if anyone ever truly pieced it together." Dr. Graves's voice trailed off, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. "If anyone knew he was your son, you made a decision years ago to keep him close, not to free him, not to acknowledge him, just close, like a secret you can't destroy. But secrets have a way of festering, Edmund. They poison everything." Elias froze, the pitcher of water heavy in his hands. He heard Edmund's heavy sigh, then the clink of glass. "I know the risks, Nathaniel. I live with them every day. But I cannot send him away, not now." The conversation ended abruptly as Edmund coughed, a deep, rattling sound. Elias quickly retreated, his mind reeling. Dr. Graves's words confirmed everything. Edmund had made a conscious decision years ago to keep Elias close, to have him within his sight, a living penance, a constant reminder of his sin, but never to truly acknowledge him. It was a twisted form of possession, a desperate attempt to control a truth he could not face. The house, already a repository of secrets, began to show deeper cracks. Mrs. Price, the stoic housekeeper who had carried the weight of the Hatcher family's hidden history for decades, slowly began to unravel. The strain of her knowledge, the constant vigilance required to maintain the facade, was finally taking its toll. Her movements became less precise, her silences more brittle. She began to make small mistakes, to forget minor details, her eyes often distant, haunted. One afternoon, Elias found her in the pantry, her hands trembling as she polished a silver tray. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were wide with a desperate, almost frantic fear. "It's all coming apart, Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The house, it's sick. And the master, he's losing his grip." She spoke of Nora, not directly, but in veiled allusions, hinting at the injustice, the betrayal, the terrible price paid for Edmund's pride. She spoke of the portrait, of the letters, of the child. She spoke of a decision made long ago, a decision that had poisoned everything. Elias listened, his heart heavy. He knew Mrs. Price was close to breaking. that the burden of her knowledge was becoming too great. He tried to offer a silent comfort, a steady presence, but he knew it was futile. The house was indeed sick, and its sickness was contagious. A week later, Mrs. Price was found dead in her bed. The official cause, pronounced by Dr. Graves, was a sudden heart ailment. But Elias knew better. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the way she had been teetering on the edge of revealing too much. He had heard the hushed, urgent conversations between Edmund and Thomas in the days leading up to her death. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Mrs. Price had been silenced. Not with violence, perhaps, but with a calculated, insidious pressure, a fear so profound it had stopped her heart. Her death was a stark, brutal reminder that the secret that made him chosen also made him dangerous. He was not safe. The truth he carried was a weapon, and those who knew it, or threatened to reveal it, paid the ultimate price. Clara Hatcher, her face pale and drawn, sought Elias out in the garden one evening, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Elias," she said, her eyes wide with genuine fear, "you must be careful. More careful than you have ever been. My father, he is capable of anything to protect his name, and Thomas, he is a viper." She looked around nervously, as if expecting to be overheard. Mrs. Price, her death was no accident. Not truly. She knew too much, and now you are the one who knows. Her hand, usually so delicate, gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Be careful, Elias, for your own sake, for Nora's sake." Her words, spoken with such raw, uncharacteristic fear, confirmed his darkest suspicions. Clara, too, was genuinely frightened, not just for herself, but for him, but for... The cracks in the house were widening, and Elias knew that the ground beneath his feet was becoming increasingly unstable. He was living on borrowed time, a pawn in a deadly game, and the truth he carried was a ticking bomb, threatening to shatter the entire edifice of Oakwood. The death of Mrs. Price, swift and chillingly convenient, solidified Elias's understanding of the true nature of the house and the man who ruled it. The secret was not merely a burden, it was a living, breathing entity that demanded sacrifices, and Elias, the unacknowledged son, was now at its very heart. He understood that his knowledge was not just power, but a profound vulnerability. He could not speak it. He could not act on it. The law, the society, the entire brutal architecture of Virginia in 1855 made the truth he carried not just unspeakable, but potentially lethal. To reveal it would be to invite destruction, not just for Edmund, but for himself, for Clara, for anyone who dared to challenge the established order. He moved through his days with a new, profound sense of isolation. The other house slaves, sensing the shift in the house's atmosphere, avoided him, their glances wary, their whispers hushed. He was marked, set apart, not just by Edmund's choice, but by the terrible knowledge he now possessed. One afternoon, while cleaning Edmund's study, his gaze fell upon a loose floorboard beneath the master's heavy desk. It was almost imperceptible, a slight discoloration in the wood, a faint gap. His heart quickened. He remembered the letters, the hidden drawer. He knelt, his fingers tracing the outline of the board. With a careful, almost surgical precision, he pried it open. Beneath, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a single document. It was a legal paper, its parchment yellowed with age, its ink faded. Elias carefully unrolled it. It was a deed of manumission, a document that would have legally recognized Elias, granting him his freedom and, more shockingly, acknowledging his parentage. The names were there, clear as day. Elias, son of Nora, and of Edmund Hatcher. The date was 1835, when Elias would have been 10 years old. But it was unsigned, unfiled, never submitted. Edmund Hatcher had drafted it. He had held it in his hands. He had considered it. And then he had hidden it away, unable to destroy it, but equally unable to act upon it. It was a testament to his profound internal conflict, his desperate struggle between a flicker of conscience and the crushing weight of societal expectation, of pride, of shame. He could not bring himself to acknowledge his son. to shatter the carefully constructed facade of his life, to risk the scandal that would surely follow. But he also could not bring himself to completely erase the truth, to destroy the only legal recognition of Elias's existence. So he had buried it, like so many other truths, beneath the floorboards of his study, a silent, agonizing testament to his cowardice and his enduring, twisted attachment to the secret. Elias held the document in his hands, the paper rustling softly, a ghost of a chance, a phantom future. He thought of his mother, Nora, her quiet strength, her fierce love, her desperate plea in the letters for her son to know a life beyond the fields. He thought of the 22 years of his life, lived in the shadow of a secret that was always about him, a truth that had defined his very existence without his knowledge. He thought of the injustice, the profound, soul-crushing injustice of it all. This piece of paper, this unsigned decree, represented everything he had been denied, everything his mother had hoped for him. A wave of profound grief, mixed with a cold, burning anger, washed over him. He could have been free. He could have had a name, a recognized lineage. He could have had a life. But Edmund Hatcher, his father, had chosen shame over honor, pride over justice, silence over truth. He stood there for a long time, the document in his hands, the weight of it immense. He could take it. He could expose Edmund. He could shatter the house, the family, the entire carefully constructed world of Oakwood. But what would it gain him? A brief, violent upheaval, followed by what? Retribution, a life on the run, the destruction of Clara's fragile peace, the confirmation of Thomas's darkest fears. In this world, in this time, a black man, even one with a white father, had no legal recourse, no true justice. The truth, in this context, would not liberate. It would only destroy. With a heavy heart, Elias carefully folded the document, placed it back in its oilcloth wrapping, and returned it to its hiding place beneath the floorboard. He pressed the board back into place, ensuring it was perfectly aligned, leaving no trace of his discovery. He said nothing. He spoke to no one. But something in him was now permanently different. The silence he carried was no longer someone else's burden, someone else's shame. It was his own choice. He had seen the truth, held it in his hands, and consciously decided to bury it again, not out of fear, but out of a profound understanding of the world he inhabited. He would carry this truth, not as a weapon, but as a shield, a silent knowledge that would guide his path. The weight of the truth was immense, but Elias, forged in the crucible of Oakwood's secrets, was now strong enough to bear it, knowing that some battles were not fought with words or documents, but with an enduring, silent will. Just when we thought we understood what Edmund Hatcher was hiding, the truth reveals itself as something far more disturbing than any of us could have imagined. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The year 1861 arrived like a storm front, dark and ominous, bringing with it the thunder of distant cannons and the chilling winds of war. The fragile peace that had long masked the deep fissures in American society and within the Hatcher household finally shattered. The Civil War began, and its brutal reality began to tear at the very fabric of Oakwood. The plantation, once a symbol of prosperity, began to fracture. The fields, once meticulously tended, showed signs of neglect as the labor force dwindled. Some fleeing north, others pressed into service for the Confederate cause. The sounds of distant skirmishes, the rumors of battles fought and lost, permeated the air, replacing the familiar rhythms of plantation life with a pervasive sense of dread. Thomas Hatcher, fueled by a potent mix of Southern pride, inherited cruelty, and a desperate need to prove himself, eagerly enlisted with the Confederacy. He rode off to war with a flourish, leaving behind a trail of debt, a legacy of petty tyrannies, and a house that breathed a collective sigh of relief at his absence. His departure, however, left Edmund Hatcher even more isolated, more vulnerable, clinging to the remnants of his authority with a desperate, almost pathological grip. Clara Hatcher, however, found her quiet rebellion transformed into active, albeit clandestine, resistance. Her sadness, once a passive lament, now fueled a quiet determination. She had, over the years, cultivated a network of contacts, abolitionist sympathizers in the North and courageous individuals within Virginia who believed in a different future. Under the cloak of night, with a quiet courage that belied her delicate appearance, she began to help several enslaved individuals from Oakwood and neighboring plantations escape north, guiding them to safe houses, providing them with what little resources she could spare. Elias, observing her furtive movements, her hushed conversations, understood her purpose, and a silent mutual respect grew between them, a shared understanding of the moral rot that permeated their world. He never spoke of what he saw, but his silent acknowledgement was a comfort to Clara, a rare moment of shared truth in a world of lies. Edmund Hatcher, now aged and diminished, seemed to shrink within his grand house. The war, the loss of his son to its uncertain embrace, the dwindling productivity of his land, the erosion of his social standing, all these external pressures seemed to accelerate his internal decay. He clung to Elias with an almost pathological desperation. Elias was no longer just a servant, no longer just a secret. He was a lifeline, a constant presence in a world that was rapidly crumbling around Edmund. He was the only one who remained, the only one who bore witness to Edmund's slow, agonizing collapse. The master's once formidable presence was now reduced to a frail, trembling figure. His hands, once strong and commanding, now shook uncontrollably. His eyes, once sharp and piercing, were clouded with a profound weariness, a deep-seated fear. He spent most of his days in the study, drinking heavily, staring at the portrait of the unnamed woman, his mind lost in the labyrinth of his past. One particularly bleak evening, as the sounds of distant cannon fire rumbled like an angry god across the Virginia landscape, Edmund Hatcher summoned Elias to the study. The room was dim, lit only by a single sputtering candle, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Edmund sat slumped in his chair, his face pale, his breath shallow. He looked utterly broken, a man stripped bare of his pride, his authority, his very essence. "Elias," Edmund rasped, his voice barely a whisper, thick with whiskey and despair. He gestured vaguely towards the decanter. Elias poured him another drink, his movements automatic, his heart heavy. He knew this was it, the final unraveling. Edmund drank deeply, then fixed his gaze on Elias, his eyes wide, almost childlike in their vulnerability. The war, it takes everything. Everything a man builds, everything he believes in. He paused, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips. "My father, he would be ashamed of what I have become, of what this place has become." He spoke of Nora, not by name, but in veiled allusions, in fragmented sentences that painted a picture of a desperate, forbidden love, a moment of weakness, a promise made in haste and broken in fear. He spoke of the child, of the burden of his existence, of the shame, the fear of scandal, the need to preserve his name, his legacy, his order. It was not a confession, not an apology, but a desperate, broken attempt at a connection that he had spent 30 years refusing to build. He was trying, in his final moments of lucidity, to explain, to justify, to unburden himself of the crushing weight of his secret. She was beautiful, Elias," Edmund whispered, his gaze drifting to the portrait, then back to Elias's face. "Strong, fierce, like you." He reached out a trembling hand, as if to touch Elias's arm, but stopped short, his hand hovering in the air, unable to bridge the chasm of their relationship. Then, in a moment of terrible intimacy, a slip of the tongue born of profound despair, Edmund Hatcher called Elias by his mother's name. "Nora," he breathed, his voice barely audible, his eyes fixed on Elias's face, as if seeing her reflection there. "My Nora." He stopped himself abruptly, his eyes widening, a flicker of shame returning to his gaze. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. Elias looked at the old man, his father in the dim, flickering light of the study. He said nothing. Not because he had nothing to say, not because he felt no emotion, but because some truths, spoken aloud in a world like this, did not liberate anyone. They only destroyed. They shattered the fragile peace, ignited the fires of retribution, and brought down the wrath of a society built on lies. He understood that Edmund's brokenness was his own punishment, a torment far greater than any Elias could inflict. He understood that the silence he had carried for so long was not just a burden, but a shield, a means of survival. He had borne witness to the collapse of a man, the unraveling of a legacy, and the final agonizing confession of a secret that had consumed a lifetime. He stood there, a silent, unmoving sentinel, watching the last embers of Edmund Hatcher's pride flicker and die, knowing that the true cost of the master's choice was not just his own life, but the very soul of the man who had made it. The war ended in April of 1865, not with a bang, but with a weary sigh that swept across the ravaged landscape of Virginia. Emancipation, a word once whispered in hushed tones, now rang out with the force of a trumpet, shattering the chains of generations. For Elias, it was not a sudden burst of joy, but a quiet, profound shift, a lifting of an invisible weight he had carried his entire life. The world, once rigidly defined, now stretched out before him, vast and uncertain, yet filled with the terrifying promise of self-determination. On a morning in late April, under a sky that was finally clear and blue, Elias walked off the Hatcher plantation. He took nothing with him, not the letters, still hidden in the locked drawer of the study. Not the unsigned deed of manumission, still buried beneath the floorboards. Not a single object from the house, no memento of his years spent living inside its suffocating secrets. He left everything where it was, exactly as he had found it, a silent testament to the truths he had unearthed and the choices he had made. He carried only the clothes on his back, the calluses on his hands, and the profound, indelible knowledge etched into his soul. He walked away from Oakwood, from the fields, from the house, from the ghosts, and from the man who had been both his master and his father. He walked towards an unknown future, a free man, carrying a silence that was now finally his own. Edmund Hatcher died 6 weeks later, in early June, officially of a lung ailment. A body worn out by years of drink, despair, and the crushing weight of his unconfessed sins. His death was quiet, almost unnoticed amidst the chaos of a defeated South. The house, now truly empty of its master, seemed to exhale, its oppressive silence replaced by a mournful echo. The study was eventually cleared, its contents catalogued and sold. The locked drawer was found, empty. No one knew who had emptied it, or when. The letters, the portrait, the hidden document, all were gone, vanished into the currents of history. Their secrets finally laid to rest, or perhaps carried away by hands that understood their true value. Clara Hatcher, her spirit finally unbound by the death of her father and the end of the war, left Virginia shortly after Edmund's passing. She sold her meager inheritance, severed all ties with the remnants of her family, and disappeared north, never to be heard from in Pittsylvania County again. Her quiet rebellion had found its ultimate expression in freedom, a life lived far from the shadows of Oakwood. Thomas Hatcher returned from the war a broken man, his swagger replaced by a haunted emptiness. He tried to salvage what remained of the plantation, but the land, like the family, was too fractured to heal. He sold off parcels, piece by piece, until nothing was left of the once grand Oakwood. He, too, eventually disappeared into history, his name fading into the annals of a lost cause, his cruelty ultimately consuming him. And the reason Edmund Hatcher chose Elias to live inside the house. It was never written down, not in any county record, not in any church register, not in any letter that survived the ravages of time and war. It died with Edmund, a secret too shameful, too profound, too dangerous to ever commit to paper. Or perhaps It walked off the plantation on that April morning, a truth finally belonging only to itself, carried in the heart of a man who had learned that some stories are best left unspoken, their power residing not in their revelation, but in their enduring, chilling silence. And so, the house on the hill, stripped of its secrets, slowly crumbled, a monument to a truth that was never written down, a testament to the terrifying power of human choice and the enduring, haunting question of why. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories of dark American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next story.